Hi, everyone, and welcome to the show. This week, I'm asking a question that's probably a little bit difficult to ask at times, but I think it's something that probably needs to be asked right now, and that is Europe's support for Ukraine faltering? I had the idea to do this show probably a few weeks back when I was at a ministerial meeting here in Brussels of EU ministers. And I had some EU officials suggesting to me that the fact that Ukrainian ministers get to speak at every single one of those meetings when all the ministers from the 27 EU member states come in to Brussels, that maybe that can't continue forever. That was the kind of suggestion from some of the people that was, and I heard this from kind of a few different places. And it made me think, is there a bit of a shift? You know, we're well over a year since the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started by Russia. And Volodymyr Zelensky gets to speak to the leaders pretty much every time that they meet for their summits. And so that sort of sparked the idea for me. And then what we've had over the last week is we've seen a number of EU countries decide that they're going to shift their support or ban the imports of grains like wheat and maize from Ukraine. Ukraine's a really big producer of agricultural products, of food products. And we've seen that. So I'm just I'll do a little bit of a preamble explaining what's going on with the grain. And then I've got four people that are going to come and speak to the show today. One of them, Sándor Zsíros. He's a Hungarian journalist working for Euronews, an excellent journalist who really knows this city inside out and knows those countries that perhaps aren't, Hungary specifically, supporting Ukraine quite so much as the others. I've also got Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, who's the chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Integration of Ukraine to the European Union, a member of the Ukrainian Parliament. She's got some really interesting insights about what a changing tide of support for the war effort by Western countries, and so specifically European countries, what that actually might mean. I'm also going to speak to Mircea Barbu, who is an independent journalist from Romania, who can talk us about the port of Constanța, which is a really important Romanian port, which is being used to take a lot of the grain from Ukraine out into the rest of the world, because the Ukrainian farmers are feeding a lot of the world. So he's going to be able to bring insight into that. He also has reported extensively from the front line in eastern Ukraine as well. And I'm also going to speak to Max Hess, who's a political risk and geopolitics advisor who knows Russia super well and can explain a little bit about what all this means more broadly regionally and more broadly internationally. So I'm just going to bring you up to date from where we are right now at point of recording on the grain issue. Quick reminder, though, that this show streams live on Twitter, YouTube, and on LinkedIn. But eventually the plan is for it to live on YouTube. So if you're watching this on Twitter or LinkedIn, there's a link which will allow you to subscribe to the YouTube channel. And that makes it easier for me, basically. I'm producing this thing myself, so it's easier to sort of have it living on YouTube. And also, if you can't watch the whole show and you want to listen, I post the audio track onto Spotify. If you search Jack Parrock Live on Spotify, you can listen to the whole thing again afterwards. So to this grain issue, what happened is 5 countries sent a letter to the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, they announced a few days ago that they wanted to ban the imports of grain from Ukraine, because what it was doing was skewing their markets. Ukrainian grain was coming in cheap, meaning that their own farmers were losing money, and also that they weren't able to sell it because that grain wasn't moving on. And the countries that are involved were mainly Poland, which has a long border, a direct connection with Ukraine, and a lot of it was coming out through there, but also Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary as well. And you can see in this letter, they say that these problems are related to a substantial increase in the supply of Ukrainian products to the markets. Given the scale of the phenomena, it's necessary to increase the amount of EU funds. So they want EU money. Also, the letter continues to say that they want financial support for a more rapid development of transport infrastructure and strengthening connectivity. So this was a letter, there's quite a lot in it. I don't want this show to be about the sort of specific grain issue going on today, which is a hot issue actually, and there's a lot to be talked about. But I really want to talk more about what it means and what it signifies as part of this issue as we continue, as the war in Ukraine is continuing. Now, there's been another set of letters as well. The Ukrainian Agricultural Ministry said that a few days ago, said it wants cooperation with those partners. But it also said that the decisions on the Polish side, which was the first country where most of the grain was going out, it contradicts agreements that they have with them. And it says it proposes to agree with the Polish side on a new memorandum of understanding to try and sort it out. So we're kind of in this place right now. What we had is a meeting of those 5 countries with a senior EU European Commissioner to discuss this. There's quite a lot in that, but I'll just play you out a soundbite from Eric Mama, who's the chief spokesperson for the European Commission, for what he had to say today. There was quite a lot in the midday briefing. They do a daily briefing of the European Commission. Anyway, this is what he had to say about this. I'll just play it out for you.
About investigations to see if it is justified to have measures for these products, and that's exactly what the letter from the president announces, that we will do safeguard investigations on a series of other products that are said by the frontline member states of being problematic, but on which we first want to investigate.
It's a bit of a classic EU reaction. We're going to investigate. So that's what we heard. But they're having discussions, and they are saying that they want to create a new set of money to help the farmers in those countries. I'm also just going to bring in a little soundbite from Mateusz Morawiecki, who's the Polish Prime Minister. He gave a speech about a week ago now at the Atlantic Council. So I've ripped this from their video feed. And I think it's interesting because it shows, I mean, the Poles are still saying that they're heavily supporting the Ukrainians in the war effort. Just take a listen to what he had to say.
We want to regain stable development, but Ukraine's military victory alone is not enough for this. We need a new Marshall Plan for Ukraine and the entire region. Today, Poland is the key to rebuilding the Euro-Atlantic, EU-US order and EU-US relations.
So this is the context. There's a sort of support for Ukraine that's it's been overwhelming. Really, there's been a huge outpouring over since the invasion began, that Ukraine should be supported. There's been military, there's been an ammunition plan from the European Union to send many rounds of ammunition. Tanks have been sent from the member states. There's been a huge shift in how the European Union is dealing with this, but there's also a counter shift, I think. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to bring in Sándor Zsíros, who is the Hungarian journalist with Euronews. And I'm really happy to have you on the show today, mate.
Hi, Jack. Thanks for inviting me to your show.
Yeah,
very happy also.
We sat next to each other for a long time working at Euronews, and I know that you are a source getter, a story pusher, and so I'm really pleased to have your insight. What's your read on this, Sándor? This grain issue? Do you sense that there is a shifting tide where European countries are just not going to be supporting Ukraine in the way that they perhaps have up until now since the invasion?
I think it's a very significant development, honestly. I mean, I'm covering pretty much Central European events also, and like 2 weeks ago, I already saw that this is coming and this might be huge. You know, the Polish agricultural minister resigned. There were non-stop protests in Romania, and you know, the European Commission was just sleepwalking into this. They didn't take it really seriously until, you know, these 3 countries pulled the handbrake and they stopped the Ukrainian grain imports. When you look at the big picture, I mean, the whole issue shows what sort of problems we will have once Ukraine will be actual member of the EU, if they will ever be an actual member of the EU. So it's a country of 40 million people. It's a country with a massive agricultural production, with a lot of imports. And, you know, nobody was prepared for this tariff-free regime in Central Europe last year when the prices were, much higher. Everyone was expecting that, this grain will flow outside of Europe to Africa, to the Middle East, etc. And, it's just became cheap, and it became a lot of these products that immediately show the problem that we will have once Ukraine will be inside. So, and also that there are other kind of problems, very practical problems that I hear mostly from Hungary, that these products are not the same quality that we produce in Europe, but they have access to the free market, and they are using different kind of pesticide and different standards, and they are actually not checked regularly. But I would say the whole big picture, what we see here, that especially Poland, the biggest supporter of Ukraine inside the EU, blocked the imports. I think this is, not a turning point in terms of supporting Ukraine in the war, but a turning point in a way how we see the future with Ukraine, how we, Europe, or at least Central Europe is hits the reality that we might see in the coming years. And I would like to see also, the European Commission taking these issues more seriously. Nevertheless, they still think it's a regional problem. It's not affecting the whole of the EU market. But, the EU market is like this. When it
Yeah.
hits one region, everything is affected. Nevertheless, my personal perception is if it would have happened in France or Germany, the Commission would have been much quicker to find a way out.
Yeah, the pressure of the Franco-German axis is heavy here in Brussels. Do you think it signifies something about maybe this is about the agricultural products, right? That's what they're really worried about right now. But do you think there may be some concerns that it potentially could go over into other issues? Like you say, Poland has been militarily very supportive, economically supportive. There's a lot of Ukrainians living in Poland right now. Do you think this kind of thing can shift, and in Hungary as well, and in the other countries? Do you think this can shift public sentiment?
For the moment, I don't think so. Most of the EU leaders, except maybe Hungary, they are pretty much supportive towards Ukraine, and they want to deal with this situation. They want to find a quick fix. And if they find this quick fix, if I understand well, in these 5 countries, Ukrainian grain cannot stay. It will be, in a way, it will be banned. So they will be just transiting it. So if it happens, I don't see a real danger. But, the issue is we don't know how long we have to support Ukraine and how much money it will cost and what will be the end of the war. And, there are the upcoming American elections will influence also pretty much European policymakers in this. And, soon or later, a point of fatigue will come into the European publics, where people will say that, okay, we are with Ukraine, we are supporting them, but we have to also deal with our own issues, with the inflation, with the rising prices, economic. And some of the leaders, especially in my country, in Hungary, they are using it very well. They are using these selfish arguments that it's actually not our business what's going on in Ukraine. It's their business, and we don't care about them. I think it can spread, but for the moment, I think we are not there yet. But it's a very big warning signal what happened. And you mentioned, the Franco-German acts in the European Union. That's a very important thing. And when you look at the perspective, they promised Ukraine membership, full membership. But who is thinking about, how this would shape the European Union in the long term? Accepting a country of 40 million, it's, first of all, it's a long process, but it would also shift the whole power structure of the EU. Will the German Franco axis agree to have inside the European Union another axis of Polish, Ukrainian, which would be a massive voting power. I mean, we have to think about these issues. We need time to think all of these issues, also the trade issues. Also, I mean, Ukraine is not there yet. We all know, and they are at war, and they need to develop their standards to get the membership. It's a long process, but I mean, we should have a common vision, which is not there yet, which is, of course, will not be there unless the war is closed.
Yeah.
But I have many questions, and when we offer this kind of fast track process to Ukraine, I think it's also a bit of false promise to the Ukrainians who are believing that okay, in a couple of years we will be full members. But I mean,
this is it. I mean, most people don't understand it takes at least a decade, 15 years to get into the European Union. There's a ton of really boring bureaucracy, massive reforms that are required. But I think it is interesting because Ukraine isn't just trying to sort of come out of the sphere of influence of Russia. Actually, this whole movement that has angered Russia so much is because it wants to join the European Union and because it wants to join NATO. Now, you're from Hungary and you report on Hungarian issues extensively. That was a country that was complicated for the EU to take in and has proven to be a nightmare, really, for the institutions in Brussels. Perhaps not for other people that perhaps don't like the way that the EU works. What's the Hungarian angle on this, Sándor?
Hungarian angle? You mean Ukraine entering the EU, or the grain issue, or generally?
Grain issue, the current climate. Hungary's kind of
so
going to Moscow. Szijjártó, the foreign minister, went there and had meetings with them.
Okay, so I can explain you Hungarian foreign politics in basically one sentence. It's pretty basic. When there is an international conflict, they are making gestures towards the strongest, so not the weak, but the strong, and then they ask for commercial benefits. This is what they do with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This is what they did when Turkey had an offensive in Syria. It has a long history, and this is what they do. So they are not blocking, essential things for the EU, for the NATO, but they are being annoying just to show Putin that, hey, we are here and we don't agree with these liberals in Brussels because we don't really like them. But for the big picture, they are okay. What is
do you just let me stop you? Do you think the Hungarians will turn against Ukraine in some sense?
I think what they will do is, during the process, they will try to get everything out of it for themselves. So they will veto things just to get European funds. They will veto other things, to get something else. And it's gonna be tough, but I don't think they will block it, because we still belong to the West, and we have to accept the reality that that's our political family. What is striking for me, that a big chunk of the Hungarian public is taking this pro-Russian propaganda so seriously, and they are identifying with them, that especially online and especially in public media, that it's really shocking that it can happen in a European country. And also, some of our politicians have a much better reputation in Central Asian countries or in Russia than in the European Union, and that makes also the things much more difficult for them. Prime Minister Orbán said himself in a radio interview that he feels uncomfortable at the European Council meetings, and then when you see he get the red carpet in Moscow or in, I don't know, Astana or somewhere else, this
Like
is
that.
it has also a kind of psychological background for them, that they are not welcomed anymore that much in Brussels, but if they go to the east, to China, they are kings, like
Really interesting. We could talk about that a lot more. Sándor, I really appreciate you joining this show today, and for bringing your insights. Very good to have you, mate.
Thanks, Jack. Bye.
Thanks, Sándor. So that's really interesting. So that's a bit of insight of kind of what's going on in Brussels and with the eastern countries that are starting to shift this blockade on the grains. That's a big deal. Now, I was lucky enough to speak to a Ukrainian politician who is Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze. She's the chair of the Parliamentary Committee of Integration of Ukraine to the European Union. So she's in charge of the process of Ukraine in the Parliamentary Committee of Ukraine trying to enter the European Union. I actually met her in Switzerland in May last year, and she was really interesting, and she agreed to do this interview with me. The audio was a little bit difficult on the interview, but I think it's listenable. So please take a listen. Also, remember you can write your comments. I'll read everything. I'll try and respond to everything. But for now, take a listen to what Ivanna had to say. The Poles and the Hungarians, the Slovaks, etc., have done this, and what does it show to the Ukrainian people?
I think it shows that it will be pretty difficult for us to go through accession negotiations, and it will impact the tone of those negotiations with regard to capacity of the Ukrainian agricultural products and their potential impact on the internal market in the EU, because it's about actually Ukrainian products being also pretty highly competitive, and thus creating additional possible strains on the internal market. But nevertheless, I think it should not discourage either us or the EU in terms of having this path to be going through together. I think in the end, it should make both sides, so to say, stronger. But definitely at this particular moment, it feels very painful for the Ukrainian citizens. And that is, I think, totally understandable, because on the top of having to fight the war, on the top of the need to try to be secure for and care about the families, care about the basic needs of survival, people would have to also care that of the ability to earn some money, and of the ability to ensure that their work is rewarded by just adequate means.
We've seen this grain issue with these 5 EU countries, but those, for instance, Poland has come out and said we're still fully supporting in the military effort. We're still fully supporting with the Ukrainian refugees that they're hosting, etc. Do you trust that? Do you believe it? Or do you see this grain issue as something more indicative, something indicative of something bigger?
I think Polish politicians and Polish population actually across the board really well understand the threat that Russia might pose to Poland if Ukraine fails. And I think the security concern and readiness to support Ukraine militarily and support Ukrainian displaced people, because I don't want to call them refugees. I'd like them to return back to Ukraine, and I hope that we will be able to provide those possibilities for majority of the people that had to flee the war at this moment, that they will be continuing right now, the Polish partners, that they will be continuing genuinely supporting us in this different directions. And I also understand that they have to protect their own economy and their own interest as well. However, I'd prefer, I don't know at this particular moment whether they have been alarming Ukrainian authorities at the executive side for quite some time, and we did not take an action that might be also the case. We would have to explore this. But I think that this move, this closure of exports from Ukraine is seen a little bit, well, to put it in non-diplomatic terms, as a strange, hostile act. But I hope that it will not be overshadowing the readiness of Poland to stand by Ukraine, with Ukraine, in terms of fighting back on the Russian aggression.
What can you do in Ukraine as politicians, with President Zelensky, with all of the other senior ministers? What can you actually actively do to try and retain support because this is going on for a long time now. We're many months into the invasion, and eventually other things come up. What's your priority in trying to sort of raise awareness or keep awareness?
Well, I think we are very much dependent on whether the media keeps attention, Western media keeps attention to what is happening in Ukraine and keeps putting it on the top of the agenda. That is creating then better understanding of the societies in different countries, what is going on. So reaching out to such people as yourself, I think that's part of the effort that has to be made. But predominantly, we are also trying to engage very, very heavily in parliamentary diplomacy. We are trying to engage also with the civil society of Ukraine, speaking in one voice, explaining that in order for us to survive and to have the future, we have to win this war. We are there with our courage and we are there with our determination to do so, but we cannot do that without instruments. We are depending on the instruments from the external support. And so I think again and again explaining that this will spill over if it's not stopped in Ukraine. This will have an direct security impact on the citizen life. And it won't be about any economic changes anymore, any economic losses anymore. It will be about the basic security needs of every single citizen of the EU. I think that is something that should keep our support by the countries that are representing the free world. And obviously, we also have to. That's what we're trying to do, to reach out to wider international community, because Russia has been playing this card pretty seriously on the international arena, and in ensuring that it's not only the democratic countries or exclusively the representatives of the kind of Euro-Atlantic community and some of the Asian countries that are backing Ukraine, but this goes wider, and everybody understands that this is black and white. That this war does not have any shades of gray. That this is about terrorist state being trying to torture and kill and take over the whole population and the nation, and trying to wipe state and people from the map of the world. And this is something that the world cannot allow, because otherwise others will be at risk as much as Ukraine is at risk at this moment.
So one of the things I've heard, you know how Dmytro Kuleba and Volodymyr Zelensky will either do a video call into the sort of foreign ministers' meetings in Brussels or the summit or whatever. I've had some whispers from different EU officials that really can't continue for much longer, that it's uncommon to have a non-EU country able to speak at every meeting. What do you think it would mean if the ministers and the leadership of the Ukrainian government were no longer invited to the significant meetings of the European ministers?
That would mean that the EU is trading off its values for comfort, or for the presumed comfort of the usual go-abouts. And I think it would be a great mistake if Ukraine would be cut out of those discussions at this particular moment before we win this war. After we win this war, I think we go back to normality, hopefully go through the negotiations on accession to the EU, would hopefully have the real perspective of joining NATO in order to have the durable and sustainable peace in this part of the world. But that can be done, the kind of coming back to normality can be done only after Russia is defeated in this war, and we would all have to agree on this.
Ivanna, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining the show today.
Thank you, Jack.
So that was Ivanna there talking. I mean, really interestingly, the position in Ukraine is that the support needs to continue, and not only the support, the active support, but also the symbolic support. Now, a lot of people on the last stream said they were disappointed not to see my little puppy. This is Teddy. This is my production assistant. It's just me and him putting this show together, isn't it, Ted? So I promised I'd bring him back in. He sits at my feet as we do the whole show. So that's the position from Ukraine. And now I'm going to, as promised, I'm going to bring in Mircea Barbu, who I spoke to a little bit earlier as well, who's got a really interesting perspective. He's worked extensively. He's just come back from Kherson in eastern Ukraine, and he's now working on stories in Romania. He's a Romanian journalist, and he's got some really interesting insights. Take a listen to our conversation that I had with him earlier. Government's decided that they want to block grain as well. The port of Constanța is really important for this. What's going on from the Romanian perspective?
So, Jack, at the moment, there's a big debate in Romania concerning the grain imports from Ukraine, the grain shipments. As you said, Constanța is one of the most important hubs, if not the most important hub for grains coming out of Ukraine at the moment, and it's been so since the beginning of the war. Romania has been very supportive when it comes to, the Romanian government has been very supportive when it comes to getting the grains and helping Ukrainians get their grains out. But now the Romanian government is facing backlash from Romanian farmers who are saying that the prices of grains have gone down significantly. The silos are full and the new crops are gonna be ready in 3 or 4 months at the latest, and there's nowhere to store them and no one to sell it to. So obviously the Romanian farmers are very angry. They staged a protest last week trying to block Siret customs or border area. Now that's the border northeast of Romania, bordering Ukraine. They gathered about 400 or 500 of them trying to block that border area, like I said, and they're voicing their concerns when it comes to grain exports. Now, the Romanian government is still supporting the Ukrainians trying to ship out their grains, but at the moment, a final decision has not been reached yet.
I know you've heard from someone at the port of Constanța who's really worried about this. Can you tell us what he told you?
So I had a brief chat with I wouldn't go as far as to say sources, but people I've met, people I've interviewed in the past concerning the grain story. And I've been working, you and I have been working on this story together, and I've been following it closely as a Romanian journalist here. And what people involved in the shipping of grains through Constanța port are telling me at the moment is that if Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland will actually stop the grain imports from Ukraine, Constanța port will be brought down to a halt, and it's going to be completely overwhelmed. So we are facing a huge crisis that is not only concerning Romania and Ukraine, but the whole world, because these grains need to be shipped to all kinds of places around the world, and a lot of countries depend on grains from Russia and Ukraine.
What do you think this all means? I mean, it's really delicate for Romania because on this it's a frontline country, but they're very supportive of Ukraine sort of politically in the war effort to try and fight off the Russian invasion. Do you think we're at a tipping point in the sentiment in Romania on this? And what would happen if we tipped over?
Absolutely. My impression is that we are at exactly that tipping point, and not just about grains, about the whole idea of supporting Ukraine. Now, Romanians have been very supportive in the beginning of the war, as most Eastern European countries, and the international community in general, Western international community, as they gathered at the borders, they offered humanitarian aid, people put up their houses. And for the most part, they were welcoming to Ukrainians. And I say where, because in the last 2 or 3 months, I've noticed a anti-Ukrainian sentiment in Romania, not as strong as, let's say, maybe other parts of the world where, it's been fueled by Russian propaganda. That's not the case in Romania. Romania is very much a country where Russian propaganda doesn't really work. I would say that Romanians are mostly not anti-Ukrainians, but they're getting to be desensitized by what's happening in Ukraine and Ukrainian problems such as grain exports, maybe refugee issues, helping the refugees transiting the country. Let's not forget that Romania is not a country where Ukrainians choose to stay. They mostly transit our country and they move westwards, maybe to Austria, Germany, and other countries. But definitely we are at a tipping point, and any decision that the Romanian government will take in the following days will be detrimental to that sentiment. It's got to either fuel that anti-Ukrainian sentiment, or it's gonna maybe help people understand that Ukrainians need the support. They desperately need our help. And that's going to show up in the polls and in the elections that are coming next year. And let's not forget, Romanian politicians are looking at this Ukrainian issue through the upcoming elections, through polls and through their votes that are going to get or not, based on this hot potato that it's becoming, the Ukrainian crisis.
Yeah, one thing, just from your personal perspective, because you've spent so much time in Ukraine over the last 18 months, including
I did.
in the east of Ukraine. You've seen the front lines. What does this feel like to you personally, between that sort of experience where you've seen the horrors of the war and this shifting sentiment in your own country?
Well, I'm gonna be honest with you, and I'm gonna say it's frustrating. I meet up with friends of mine when I come back from the front line or from Ukraine, and the first question I get from friends, family, and everyone every single time I come back from assignments is it real? Is it really happening? And to me, that's just mind-blowing, because people are not trusting my own report. And I'm talking about friends, family, close friends that I hope they trust my judgment as a journalist and as a person. And people are starting to doubt whatever's coming out of Ukraine in terms of footage, in terms of news. And it's part of the bigger mistrust in the mainstream media, of course. But when it comes to Ukraine, it's just a blatant refusal to believe that it is as bad as it is on the front line. And I'm trying to show them and I'm trying to talk to them, but obviously it's exhausting and frustrating at times, trying to explain over and over the same idea that people are struggling to get food, they have no electricity, they have no means to get out most of the times. When what Romanians see is the Ukrainians that had the means to move to Romania or transit Romania in cars, rent apartments, and that makes them doubt that it is as bad as it is. But I'm telling you, and I'm telling your viewers as well, that coming from the front lines, and I just got back last night from Kherson, which was under heavy shelling while I was there, it is as bad as you think it is, and it probably even worse in some areas.
Mircea, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate your insights on the show.
Thank you.
Really interesting to hear from him. You know, someone that spent a lot of time out there saying it is that bad. It is as bad, and that this is it. The longer a conflict like this goes on, the more desensitized perhaps we get to the images and the stories that are coming out. And as he says, as we sort of see Ukrainians doing okay in the EU and in other countries, we might forget about what's actually happening in the sort of heat of the war, which is still clearly continuing. To analyze this a bit further, I'm going to bring in Max Hess, who's a political analyst and advisor and a Russia expert, works for a lot of sort of very prominent and good research bodies and NGOs, I think is fair to say. Max, you know a lot about Russia as well. What does this mean? This discussion that we're having about whether European support for Ukraine might be faltering a bit. What does this look like to the Russians?
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I think that Russia really sees this as a potential opportunity to use what we could term the food weapon again. So that, in the first stage of the full-scale invasion, we saw Russia not only use its gas weapon, so to speak, to pressure the European nations against supporting Ukraine and against the sanctions regime they were imposing, but on global markets by attacking the ports in Oblast, and of course attacking directly in Mykolaiv and Kherson, and disrupting and seizing much of Ukraine's agricultural production in those areas. We then had the Black Sea Grain Initiative last year after Ukraine demonstrated that it actually had the ability, which Russia didn't expect, to fight back there. But lately we've seen Russia's foreign minister and a number of other officials talk about withdrawing from that initiative when it is next due to be renewed on the 18th of May next year, or possibly even earlier. Simultaneously, we've seen the Russian state really tighten the screws on international grain trading firms operating in Russia still. So, this includes Glencore's subsidiary and a number of other large grain traders that effectively have come under expropriatory pressure from the Russian state, telling them, get out, we're going to take your assets. So I think that this European disunity gives Moscow reason to believe that it can successfully use that as a pressure point to try to drive calls in Europe to end the conflict and to withdraw and curtail support for Ukraine further. So I certainly think that Moscow is happy to let these arguments happen and will try to take advantage of them in due course.
What's your sense of the sort of Western support? We've talked a lot in this show so far about European support and EU support, but what about in the UK, in the United States? They've sent a lot of military weaponry, a lot of training to the Ukrainians to support them on that military hardware. Do you think there is not a limitless, but a sort of, do you think there are timelines for Western support?
I think that both Russia and the West in a sort of long game plays to their advantage. And one of the reasons that Russia thinks that is because it hopes that it can, that political trends in the United States in particular will see support for Ukraine decrease. So, obviously the biggest and most looming threat to this would be the potential re-election of Donald Trump, who remains the forerunner for the Republican nomination next year. He has spoken openly of withdrawing support for Ukraine and making outright territorial concessions, pushing Kyiv to surrender territory to Moscow, and has intimated that he is not necessarily as much a fan of the sanctions and thinks that their costs are not worth what they're bearing. In the UK, I think that risk is quite a bit less pronounced, but there still are other places in Europe where Putin is hoping, if not to gain outright allies, then at least to find countries willing to take a more from Putin's view, pragmatic stance and one that he can exploit. And the two that I would really sort of highlight there are Bulgaria, which just had its most recent elections, is having difficulties putting together a coalition, but plays a crucial role in enabling Russian gas imports down through Turkey, and then back up through the Balkan Stream and South Stream corridors. Turk Stream. Of course, we have the Turkish elections coming up, which will be very important to that on the 14th of May next year. And then one other one is just to look forward to, forward is maybe not the right word, but to look ahead to is in September, Slovakia will have its elections. And Slovakia has also been a very strong supporter of Ukraine, but the two front runners theirs and their parties are receiving the largest polling are far more critical and certainly probably would be unlikely to give the same level of military support that the current Slovak government has given, but also potentially be less likely to support continued European action to finance Ukraine. I don't think that they would withdraw support for the sanctions regime. Even Hungary, as was already discussed, has been able to be brought on board there. But I do think it would risk potential future financial support. And what we heard from Morawiecki at the end, that need for a Marshall Plan for Ukraine and for its integration, that is something that the EU's internal divides make all but impossible. We know how reticent Germany is to any joint debt issuage, even in the aftermath of the first such issuance in the COVID pandemic, and would really have to come from the United States. And there are separate tensions as well between how the economic aspects of this conflict are shifting companies and long-term interests in production from Europe to the United States.
How quickly, I mean, you follow these kind of things intensely, how quickly can support this sort of overwhelming pro-Ukraine sentiment that we've had for quite a long time, how quickly can that fall off a cliff, if that makes sense? And what happens if those sort of support tentacles start steadily withdrawing from Ukraine? Russia overruns it? I mean, what happens?
I think that in the United States, there is the potential for support to change around the presidential election next year. But what I would say is that American sanctions in particular are a lot harder to lift than they are to put in place. So that provides a bit of structural resistance there. In Europe, however, sanctions need to be reapproved on an annual and in some cases semi-annual basis. So finding 2 or 3 other countries willing to take a harder line, to take a similar line to that taken by the Hungarian government, could have real benefits for Putin and have real impacts quite quickly on support for Ukraine. I think that a lot of what we have to keep in mind too is that a lot of the financial pledges for Ukraine have been significant, but a lot of that money also hasn't been distributed yet. And so there is the potential for that to come. And then if Ukraine can no longer meet its bills, its ability to continue financing and fighting the war could rapidly deteriorate. And so while a lot of that has been approved and is already coming, I don't think it's likely. I don't think we'll see a change in that support. But certainly if that financial support were to be withdrawn, it could have a very quick impact.
Yeah, Max, we lost your video a few times there during that. It was sort of matching up, but I think we managed to heard pretty much everything that you were saying. So I really appreciate you joining the show today and giving us your insights. Fascinating. And I mean, we've just got to watch out. Like you said, the Turkish elections, the US elections can shift very quickly how these things play out.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Max. Take it steady. So there we go. I think we'll leave the show there. Really interesting insights. I'd like to thank Ivanna, Mircea, Sándor, and Max for joining the show and for giving their insights. The point in this show, this space that I'm doing every week, is to try and give a little bit more time to these kind of discussions and ask the sort of more overarching questions that aren't perhaps always asked in the sort of normal discussions and normal broadcasting. So that's why I'm doing this. And I really appreciate everybody. I've had a lot of messages, people sending me messages of support saying they've watched it later, that they find it interesting, that this is a project they think is probably value to talk about EU, EU subjects, EU politics, things that are going on. I'll do one a week. That's the plan. I'll keep going. It's really helpful if everybody subscribes to the YouTube channel. If you're watching this on Twitter or on LinkedIn, eventually I will migrate it so it just lives on YouTube, and I cut the videos out so you can watch individual segments of it as well. And I also strip the audio and put it on Spotify. So if you want to listen to the discussion, you can listen to it on Spotify by searching Jack Parrock Live. There's also a link in the videos on YouTube to a way that you can support me in this project financially as well, because it takes a lot of work and I've only got me and Teddy doing it. So anything, if you fancy supporting the project, that'd be wonderful as well. In the meantime, huge thanks to everyone, and tune in next week where there'll be another show. I'll flag it up on all the social medias. Thank you.